Not all fantasy worlds are created equal. Some are so richly detailed that you could write an entire dissertation on their magic systems and still have no idea how their economy works, while others feel like someone just copied and pasted a generic medieval village into a Word document and called it a day. So today we're ranking fantasy world building from level 1 to level 10, based on two things: complexity and depth. I have these two factors since I believe a world can be massively complicated and yet completely lightless. Also, a massive shout out to Big Passy who gave me this idea. His video was about board games and this is about fantasy world building, but I'll leave it in the description down below. So before we dive into the rankings, let's get this one thing straight. World building is more than just lore dumps and fancy maps. A great fantasy world should feel alive. Therefore, when I reference complexity, I'm referring to how much there is to know about the world, like history, languages, cultures, and magic systems, while depth focuses on how real and immersive this world feels, even with limited information. You can kind of think of it this way. Some fantasy worlds give you 100 pages of lore, but when you stop and think about it, it doesn't really feel like actually people lived there, while others barely explain anything, yet you can feel the history in every conversation and setting. So I've created 10 levels, so let's get into it. Level 1, the coloring book fantasy world. So these are where the world looks impressive at the first glance, but the moment you dig deeper, you realize it's all just tracing or something that came before. And for this example, I will use Aragon by Christopher Paolini. Alright, I'll admit it, I have actually never read Aragon, but if there's one thing that everyone has told me about it, is that this world kind of feels like a copy-paste of Tolkien with the names being changed. But what is a level 1 coloring book fantasy world? So these are worlds that look fully developed, but are actually just a set of fantasy tropes that have been rearranged like fridge magnets. Does the world have elves? Yes. Does it have dwarves? Yes. Does it have an evil emperor? Yes. So let me just make it clear, it's not that these elements are bad, it's just that they don't feel unique. You know, if Tolkien's world, Middle-earth, was the original oil painting, then the level 1 world building is a coloring book version of that painting. The lines are all there, you just kind of have to fill them in with something vaguely fantasy-ish. Again, I haven't read Aragon myself, but I feel like I already know it because people have described it as a baby's first fantasy novel, and I'm not saying it's bad. There's a reason why Aragon was a gateway fantasy series for so many readers, but it's also the kind of world building where you can guess how things work out without even having read the book. So why is it a level 1? Simply because a level 1 world at least has some shape and structure. It's not completely hollow, I mean it has cities, factions, and maybe even a language or two, but here's the problem, it's all kind of surface level. The cultures don't feel authentic or real with unique beliefs or history. Instead, they kind of feel like fantasy templates. If you can replace an entire civilization with Tolkien elves or the Star Wars Empire and nothing changes, then it is a level 1 world. Now to be fair, a lot of first-time fantasy writers start here. It's familiar, it's comfortable, and let's be honest, it does work if you're just trying to tell a fun and good story. But to break past level 1, a world needs internal logic, a reason why its culture, politics, and magic work. And that brings us to level 2, the theme park fantasy world. A world that's fun to visit, but you don't really ask how anything actually works. So what is a theme park fantasy level 2 world? Theme park fantasy worlds are built around set piece locations and cool ideas rather than having a functional world. So they're kind of designed to be exciting, immersive, and full of personality, but the second you start asking how it all works, things start to get messy. Let's take Harry Potter for example, one of the most beloved fantasy series of all time. It's packed with amazing locations, you know, Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic, the Forbidden Forest. All of them feel incredibly real while you're reading it, but then you start thinking about how this world actually functions, and suddenly nothing makes sense. You know, why do wizards still use quills instead of pens? In this world they have flying broomsticks and time travel, but they're still dipping quills in ink like medieval monks? Also, why don't they use magic for literally everything? You know, wizards can levitate objects and teleport, but they still need to scrub dishes by hand at Hogwarts? Also, why can't they figure out phones in this world? Because they can enchant a mirror to talk to someone across the world, but Muggle technology is just beyond them. So it's not that these things ruin the books, it's just that the world wasn't built to be internally consistent. It was built to be fun, and the wizarding world is designed kind of like a theme park. It's an incredible experience while you're inside of it, but it's not built to function beyond that. Set piece locations civilizations matter more than the world logic, because the places you visit in this world feel distinct and memorable, but they don't always connect in a logical way. And often spells works when the plot needs it to, but no one actually uses them in practical ways, or at least often don't use it in practical ways. And often in level 2 world building, the world kind of bends to the protagonist's needs, because Harry, he breaks the rules, he survives impossible odds, and somehow everything still works out. And look, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, there's a reason why people love the thought of going to Hogwarts, but when you really start to think about it, the internal logic is just not really there. So a level 2 world has more personality than a level 1, but it still doesn't have the real depth or logic holding it together. It's a world you love to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there because it might collapse under its own contradictions. But what happens when the world actually has its history, politics, and cultures figured out? When it feels real instead of just fun. That's where you get to level 3, the storybook world, where the setting might be smaller, but actually makes sense. So at this level, fantasy worlds aren't sprawling, never-ending epics, they're focused, immersive, and efficient. So they do have a history and depth, but it's woven into the story and not dumped into paragraphs of exposition. And these worlds feel real, but they're not overwhelming. You don't need to have an appendices or maps to follow along. And also on level 3, culture, war, and politics matter, but they're introduced more naturally. So what is an example of a level 3 world? I would say the Poppy War by R. Kwang. Unlike a lot of fantasy worlds that are built from scratch, the Poppy War is heavily inspired by real-world history, specifically 20th century China and the Second Sino-Japanese War. The political conflicts, military strategies, and cultural dynamics feel lived in because they're rooted in reality. Also, magic exists, but it's tied to spiritual and historical traditions, and it's not just a random system from a cool fight scene, And also, you learn the world through the protagonist's journey, not through endless exposition. So this is what makes a level 3 world so good, because they feel real and immersive, but you don't need to memorize 600 years of history to get into them. So why isn't it a level 4 or 5 though? Well, because these worlds tend to be smaller in scope. You might not get like 10 plus different cultures, but the ones you do encounter feel authentic. And also on this level, it's not about huge sprawling worlds. Think of it like a well-crafted novel versus a giant fantasy saga. Both are great, but one is tight and focused, while the other is massive and intricate. So a level 3 world is deep but approachable. You feel like you can step into it, but you don't need a 300-page lore guide to enjoy it. And it's immersive, but not overwhelming. But what happens when the world starts expanding beyond a single character's perspective, when it has major nations, politics, and a deeper sense of realism? That's when we get to level 4, the epic but accessible world. So these worlds are rich and expansive, but they're still quite easy to navigate. And there's no better example of this than Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So at this level, the world is big, immersive, and full of lore, but it never feels overwhelming. There's depth to it, but it's well structured. And again, you don't need an encyclopedia to understand how the world works. The magic, the politics, and society are deeply connected, but the rules are clear and intuitive. So there's again no need for flowcharts, even though technically you could when it comes to the magic system. And you get that epic feel of grand fantasy, but without the endless confusion that comes with endless subplots and lore dumps. Think of it like a giant open world RPG that actually gives you a tutorial. You can dive in, explore, and enjoy the depth without spending 5 hours on a wiki just to understand the basics. So why do I think that Mistborn is a level 4 world? Well, let's break it down. Firstly, magic is deep, but I think it's quite easy to grasp. Allomancy is one of the best magic systems in fantasy because it's structured, it has clear rules, and makes immediate sense when you see it in action. Secondly, politics and society feel real, but they aren't overwhelming. The divide between the nobles and the Ska is central to the world, but you don't need a history lesson to get it. And thirdly, the world is vast, but it's not overly complex. The Final Empire is set in a massive setting, yet you never really feel lost. Everything is revealed at a natural pace. You never feel like you need to study for a test just to enjoy it. So a level 4 world gives you the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. It has a depth, but also a lot of accessibility. It's immersive and epic, but you never feel lost. And these worlds you can fully enjoy without needing an appendix or lore guide. Basically, it's the gateway drug to bigger, denser fantasy worlds. So, what happens when the world becomes even more complex? When history, politics, and wars aren't just a part of the backdrop, but actually drive the entire story. That's when we get to level 5, the political chessboard. On level 5, the world doesn't just sit back and wait for the protagonists to make their move. Wars are won and lost based on strategy, alliances, and betrayals, and sometimes the actions of people we actually never even meet. And no world embodies this better than the known world in A Song of Ice and Fire. At this level, the world isn't just a backdrop for adventure, it's an active force that shapes the story, and politics, war, and cultures are real power players. And the fate of nations is also decided in council chambers, not just on battlefields. And these worlds have distinct nations and cultures that feel fully realized, and each region or country has its own history, belief, and ambitions that drive the events forward. And every action also has long-term consequences. So if a war happens, the world doesn't just reset afterwards, the scars remain there for hundreds of years. And in Song of Ice and Fire, you see this in full force. So why do I say A Song of Ice and Fire is a level 5 world? Unlike many fantasy worlds, Westeros and Essos don't revolve around one single hero. Instead, we get a web of conflicting ambitions, each driven by political necessity, personal grudges, or sheer survival. And power isn't just about strength, it's also about strategy. You know, a well-placed marriage can be deadlier than an army, or a whispered rumor can topple kings faster than swords. And history and culture shape everything. The world's past conflicts and dynasties define the present, and houses have long-standing feuds and cultural traditions and regional identities. Basically, no one is untouchable. If you play the game poorly, you don't get a redemption arc, you just die. Yes, it's very sad. So why isn't this a level 6 or beyond though? Because while it's massively detailed, it's still centered on human conflicts and political intrigue. And the world is incredibly deep, yes, but it's not overwhelmingly dense. You can still follow the major factions and their histories without needing a history book. The magic, while present, is also secondary to the political and military power. Because level 5 worlds, they feel real and immersive, but they don't drown you in encyclopedic lore. You basically learn through action, not exposition. But obviously, what happens then when a world expands even further, when we go from political scheming to thousands of years of history and cultures that evolve over centuries? That's when we get to level 6, the multi-layered world, where history, culture, politics, and magic all weave together into something truly amazing and massive. So at this level, world building isn't just about one or two well-developed regions. It's about an entire interconnected world that has history, culture, and depth in every corner. And if there's one series that embodies this, I would say it's The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Each nation feels like a real civilization. These worlds have distinct economies, traditions, languages, and belief systems. And magic isn't just a flashy thing, it shapes society, and entire governments and political structures often revolve around it. Did anyone say Aes Sedai? And these worlds also have a long and complicated history. For example, in The Wheel of Time, events like the breaking of the world or the Dragon Reborn have shaped how people live today. This isn't just a world where history is just lore, it's something that is actively shaping the present. So why does The Wheel of Time belong in level 6? Because in my opinion, it's one of the most detailed and structured fantasy worlds ever created. It has extensive cultural development. Every nation has its own customs, economies, and belief systems. For example, the Aiel, the Shanshan, the Borderlanders, and the Andorans all feel like separate, distinct civilizations. And here, magic affects everything. The Aes Sedai don't just use magic, they control governments, manipulate wars, and influence history. And then also we have the male and female halves of the magic system, which creates unique conflicts and societal divides. And it also has a long history of world-shaping events. So this isn't just a setting, it's a world where every action is influenced by centuries of history. So why isn't this a level 7 world or beyond? Because even though the Wheel of Time is massively complex, it's still structured well enough that you can actually follow it. Yes, it is dense, but I think it's manageable. You might need a glossary, but the lore is introduced gradually. Unlike deeper levels we'll get to, you don't really need to take notes to remember everything that's going on, or at least not the most important things. Basically, I think that this is the perfect level for people who love deep world building, but still want to enjoy the story without getting lost in a sea of info dumps. But what happens then when a world doesn't just grow, it keeps expanding and connecting and evolving across multiple books and series? That's when we get to level 7, the unfinished encyclopedia. So some fantasy worlds have a beginning, middle, and end. You know, a clear history, a well-defined magic system, and a world that feels complete once the final page is turned. But at level 7, the world is never truly complete. read. Every book adds more layers, every new story rewrites the past, and the deeper you go, the more you realize you still don't know everything. And I think that no one does this better than Brandon Sanderson with the Cosmere. Yes, I know Mistborn has already been on this list, so technically you could make an argument that I shouldn't have put the Cosmere on here as a whole, but I think the Cosmere works really well for a so-called level 7 fantasy world. Because at this level, world building isn't just deep and immersive, it is constantly expanding. The world evolves with each new book, and new entries, they don't just expand the setting, they can also change how you understood the previous stories. There are mysteries that readers uncover over time. Often events from book 1 might connect to something in book 10 in the universe, but you won't realize it until much later. And here you need deep engagement to grasp all the layers. It's not just enough to read one book, you need to piece things together across multiple works. So this is the kind of world building where fan theories, secret references, and hidden connections become part of the reading experience. And I think the Cosmere belongs on level 7 because it's not just one world. We're talking about an interconnected universe that is still expanding. We often see the addition of new planets or magic systems and cultures, and they're all part of a larger hidden story. And characters often uncover secrets about the past that completely reshape how they and the reader see the world. You know, there's so many questions about like the shards, the god beyond, the true nature of Hoid. These aren't just background details, they change the course of the entire universe. We have layers upon layers upon layers of complexity here. And the magic systems connect across books in ways we don't notice at first when we start reading books in the Cosmere. There are tiny details in one novel that could become a major reveal in another book years later. So level 7, we have universes where everything is connected, but we don't really realize how deep it goes until you read multiple books from multiple series in this universe. But I will still say that this belongs to level 7 and not beyond, because in this universe you can read the series independently. You know, Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, they do kinda stand on their own, even if they secretly do connect. And I also think the beauty of the Cosmere, at least for now, is that you don't need a PhD, you know, to enjoy it. Because unlike higher levels, you don't have to study the wikis to understand what's going on. But if you want to go deep, the rabbit hole is waiting, because a level 7 world is the one that keeps growing, where each book doesn't just add new content, but it can rewrite how you see everything that came before. And this is also the level where world building often becomes a long-term commitment, and where fan theories become just as fun as the books themselves. But what happens when a world isn't just growing, it's so dense, so detailed, and so mythological that it feels like an actual ancient legend? That's when we get to level 8, the dense mythology. Some fantasy worlds feel like stories, and others feel like breathing societies. But then you get to worlds that feel like they were dug up from the ruins of ancient civilization. Welcome to level 8, the dense mythology, where the world is so deep and philosophical and intricate that it feels like a real historical document. And I think that no world embodies this more than Frank Herbert's Dune. I'll admit, I've only read the first book in this universe, but having watched several videos on the lore of this world, it feels like Dune would fit the bill of a level 8 world. Because at this level, world building isn't just about creating places and people, it's about crafting entire religions, philosophies, and histories that feel like they've existed for thousands of years. Every culture is so rich with belief systems, rituals, and ideology, and politics, religion, and ecologies are deeply entwined. And the world feels almost like a historical text, not just a setting. It's not like a, here's a kingdom with a king. Rather, in Dune, we have century-old power struggles between religious sects, political factions, and secret orders, all operating within a carefully balanced ecological system. So why do I think that Dune belongs at level 8? Because it's not just a sci-fi epic, it's an entire mythological and philosophical system. And the world is shaped by the environment and survival. You know, Arrakis isn't just a backdrop, it defines how its people live, think, and fight. And the scarcity of water influences social structure, warfare, and even religion. And the religious depth feels real. The Bene Gesserit control power through prophecies, genetic breeding, and cultural manipulation. And the Freeman's beliefs in Shai Hulud and prophecies aren't just flavor text, they drive the entire history. And there's so many layers to this world. We have the Spacing Guild, the Great Houses, the Emperor, and it's all about power, control, and the balance of forces. And then also the litany against fear, you know, the concept of prescience, fate, and destiny. The Dune world is a world where ideas are just as powerful as armies. And at this level, it's not just about telling a story, it's about immersing the reader in an entire system of belief and philosophy in history and so on. So why isn't Dune a level 9 or 10 though? Because because I think that while it's a massively intricate world, it is still possible to engage with it as a reader. Yes, it's dense, but it is still quite readable. Yes, it's very heavy on philosophy, but it's still structured as a story. And yes, it is crazy deep, but it's still relatively contained. And yes, the Dune universe expands in later books, or at least so I've been told, but it doesn't reach the heights of where you have to have like loads of encyclopedia books to even understand it, like we'll see for level 9 or 10. So I think simply put, Dune is a world that demands effort, but if you put in the work, it does reward you with one of the richest mythologies in fiction. So this is the kind of world that doesn't just make you say, wow, what a cool story. It actually makes you sit back and think about its history, politics, and the nature of power itself, and also loads of other philosophical ideas. But what happens when a world goes even deeper, when it stops feeling like just a book and starts feeling like an academic challenge? That's when we get to level 9, the academic challenge, where the world building isn't just detailed, it's a full mythological system that demands study, patience, and a very, very strong attention span. So most fantasy books, they do tell a story, but then we have some fantasy books that build a world around that story. And then there are books like the Silmarillion, which don't tell you a story, but they present to you an entire mythological history, complete with languages, religious texts, and centuries of conflict before the main events of the action novel even begin. At level 9, fantasy worlds aren't just deep, they feel like they've been studied and translated from lost historical documents almost. And also here, the book isn't just a story, it kind of works like a history book, because languages, myths, and cultures are built with obsessive detail, and the main story isn't just one small piece of an enormous world. You know, if level 8 world feels like ancient mythologies, level 9 world feels like something you'd study in a university course. So why do I think that the Silmarillion is the ultimate level 9 world? Because it's not just the backstory of the Lord of the Rings, it's an entire mythological framework written with the depth of an actual historical document. The Silmarillion is a full mythology. It's not just a novel or story. Instead, it almost reads like a collection of ancient religious texts detailing the creation of the world, the rise and fall of civilization, and the conflicts between gods and mortals. Then also, languages are fully developed and they do shape the world. As you may know, Tolkien didn't just invent names, he invented entire languages, complete with their own grammatical structures and evolution over time. And what's so fascinating is that the way the cultures interact is often dictated by linguistic and historical differences. And then also I want to mention that the history here is so vast that the main story is kind of just like a chapter of the world. You know, the events of the Lord of the Rings, the entire trilogy, could almost be seen as just a footnote of a much greater history. Because in this world we also have the rise and fall of Numenor, the wars of Beleriand, the crafting of the Silmarils. These are the true defining moments of Middle-earth, most of which the main characters never even know about. At level 9 we don't just have deep world building, we have multi-layered mythology that feels like it was written inside the world itself. But what happens when a world is so massive, so dense, so cryptic that it doesn't just feel like an academic study? It feels like a puzzle no one fully understands, potentially not even the author. That's where we get to level 10, the bottomless abyss of lore. As I'm sure you know by now, some fantasy worlds are immersive, some are mythological, and then there are worlds that feel like they were written for ancient scholars, by ancient scholars, that are massively cryptic, overwhelmingly deep, and almost, in my opinion, can be impossible to fully understand. Everyone, welcome to the last level, level 10, where the world building is so dense, so interconnected, and so intimidating that even veteran fantasy readers like myself really struggle to keep up. And you know that no series captures this better than Steven Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, a series I've tried getting into twice, but I've stopped both times due to the sheer complexity of it. At level 10, fantasy worlds aren't just complicated, they are deliberately designed to be difficult to grasp. There is zero handholding. You are thrown into an ancient, complex world with no guide, no glossary, and no explanation. Well, there might be a glossary somewhere. And also at this level, societies, politics, and magic systems are massively interconnected. Every system is intricately woven into the fabric of the world, making it nearly impossible to grasp at the first glance. And every page contains layers of history, references, and hidden events. And yes, there are no info dumps because you learn through context, hints, and speculation. So if you don't pay attention, you will get lost. And if it's not obvious already, then why does Malazan belong at level 10? Because in my opinion, it is the ultimate test of patience, dedication, and deep reading. The Malison Book of the Fallen takes place in the middle of an ancient ongoing conflict. We have nations, gods, and empires that rise and fall before the reader even enters the story. Also, the magic, the gods, and the humans are all entangled. And also, the warrens and the magic systems are basically unexplained and layered in mystery. And it's so interesting because it feels like, at least from my experience, that even the characters don't fully understand how it works. And then we have gods that walk among the mortals, but their motivations are as cryptic as the world itself. And on this level, we have a massive cast with often serial introductions, and there will be hundreds, if not thousands of characters, many with multiple names, titles, and hidden paths. Just to hammer this point home, the first book alone, Guardians of the Moon, drops dozens of factions, conflicts, and concepts in the first chapters, and there are no explanations given. You don't ease into Malison. You kinda survive Malison, or in my case, you die. Rest in peace. So yes, a level 10 world isn't just dense, it's massive and it's cryptic and so layered that even experienced readers will struggle to keep up. And here there's zero handholding because you're thrown into the deep end and every page will contain layers of history, philosophy, or hidden meanings. This isn't just reading a fantasy world, this is decoding a fantasy world. And there you have it, level 10 world building, the deepest, most challenging kind of fantasy ever written. For some, this is too much, an impossible puzzle that will really test your patience, but for others, it is the ultimate reward. So, are you brave enough for a level 10 world? If you want to know my full thoughts on where fantasy is going, check out this video.
Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that I have a Viking book club on my Patreon. If you join my Patreon, then you get access to an exclusive book club where every single month we read one book together and the book can be put forward by you. If you join tier 3 or 4, then you can put a book forward and then I randomly choose a book from the pot that we end up reading together, and throughout the month we discuss the book on the Patreon chats. And then we also have Zoom hangouts, which honestly are some of my favorite times of the month. This month we're reading this book, and next month we're gonna be reading this book. Also, since I launched my Patreon, I basically spent my money back into the channel on video editing. I've had more than 40 videos professionally edited, so if you want to support what I do here and also help me upload more consistently, then I'll leave a link in the description down below.